Hello and welcome to Dr. Wheeler and everybody watching this video. My name is Mateja Lucic, and for my CIS 9467 project, I will be looking at New York City housing data. So to begin, I just wanted to briefly mention what I do for work and transition into how I came into my research topic in question. Currently, I'm working for a legal services organization that focuses on housing law and human rights for low-income individuals in Brooklyn. A lot of the work we do is focused on rent-stabilized and rent-controlled housing, and through our work we see that generally low-income individuals are disproportionately impacted by housing cases and evictions. But all of that is anecdotal. We can talk about it all day long, but I wanted to look at the actual numbers and see what the reality is. Initially, for my research question and topic, I wanted to look at whether there is a disparate impact of evictions in New York City by demographic data such as race, gender, age, and income, etc. But when I looked at New York City Open Data, the U.S. Census website, and other websites, other data websites, I quickly saw that there was no tracking of demographics and income levels on a zip code basis done by the city and federal government. And I thought it would be helpful to look at it from from a zip code area to have a comparison of lower income neighborhoods and higher income neighborhoods and see how case numbers and evictions for each compare. Anyway, I didn't want to give up on my topic, and I figured it was still possible to look at overall city statistics and at least compare on a borough-wide level. So to get into it, today I will be looking at whether there is an unequal distribution of New York City housing court cases and evictions. As I mentioned, for this project, with the exception of the population data, which I'll cover a little bit later, which was pulled from the U.S. Census, the information in this presentation came entirely from New York City Open Data. So the first thing we see here is the housing litigation data for New York City for all 5 boroughs starting in January of 2017. A lot of the data in this set is really just irrelevant for this presentation, but I didn't want to take it out just because of so we can get a general sense of what's in here. This is a very hefty data set. I think there's about 40,000 rows or so. Similar with the eviction data, I think maybe 60,000 rows of data. But same thing here. So there's a lot of data that we don't necessarily need, but things like what borough it is in, the zip code, which I would have liked to look at and compare. It's all in there. So this is also starting in January 2017, so it's comparable to the housing litigation data. Additionally, I wanted to just see on a very big picture sense the total amount of housing units in each borough, whether occupied or unoccupied. So this data is from the census. And as you can see, Brooklyn is the largest borough in terms of housing units. Staten Island is by far the smallest, etc. Additionally, I looked at 2020 population. This is an estimate, but I know it's fairly accurate. This is an estimate of borough-wide populations for the 5 boroughs. So looking at the data, I created pivot tables for both the housing court cases and evictions. Originally, I had it all as figures. I figured it's a little bit easier to look at as percentages. And moving on to the dashboard, one thing to mention about that really struck me was that year by year for both litigation brought in each borough and the eviction totals in each borough, it's kind of eerily similar or proportionate from the whole pie. I don't know if this is just generally the way statistics work, or if there is something else going on here, if there's a quota that once it is met in a certain borough, there's no more evictions, or if it's done proportionally to population, which wouldn't make any sense. So that was one thing that was actually really surprising to me. You can see, for example, we're looking at Queens here. 2017, 19% of the total city evictions were in Queens. In 2018, just a little bit above 20%. 2019, just under 20%. And then 2020 so far, between January and April, about 20%. So, and across the board, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Bronx, Staten Island, more or less the same thing. So to get into it, what we're looking at exactly here is litigation brought in each borough and eviction totals. So the splicers here let you look at boroughs individually. Additionally, you can look at the types of cases that are brought in each borough or in each year. I think this is something that would be particularly useful for my colleagues. I think they would like to know things like how many tenant actions are brought. In the wintertime, a lot of the cases we see are heat and hot water cases, so I'm not surprised to see that there are significant portion of the total number of cases brought. But yeah, that's something that would be particularly useful to us. Another big thing to notice here that I haven't mentioned is that the Bronx and Brooklyn are by far the two boroughs that see the most litigation and evictions. So both the Bronx and Brooklyn are about 30% or above in terms of evictions per year for the city total, which now we can look at populations and the total number of housing units in the borough to see whether there is actually a disproportionate effect or not. So like I mentioned, unfortunately, this data covers borough-wide statistics, which is unfortunate because, at least through the nature of my work, I know to be the case that neighborhoods maybe such as Williamsburg and Bushwick are definitely disproportionately affected by evictions, as opposed to neighborhoods maybe such as Park Slope or Dumbo. So unfortunately, we don't have the data to look at that, but we can still see, for example, the Bronx represents 15% of the city's total housing units and about 17% of the city's population. So that's fairly equivalent. And across the board, each borough has about the amount of housing units as their representative population, which makes sense because if there's not enough housing units to live in, people will move to another borough. So we see Staten Island, 5% housing units, 6% population. Manhattan, 25% housing units, 19% population. So I guess that's the one that really sticks out in that sense. But everything else, Brooklyn, 30, 31, Queens, 25, 27. So thinking of that and then looking at, for example, here in terms of evictions, Brooklyn and Bronx, but in these years, the Bronx is slightly edging out Brooklyn in terms of total number of evictions brought. So if we look at, for example, 2019. 2019, the Bronx saw 33% of the city's total evictions. But there's only 15% of the total housing units in the Bronx as opposed to the city's total housing units. So that's definitely a huge disparate impact in terms of evictions brought against these tenants. I mean, it's pretty much 2 to 1, more than 2 to 1. In other boroughs, it seems a little bit more proportional. Manhattan about 15%. There's about 19% of population. So that was definitely interesting to see, and it, at least to a small extent, proves my and my colleagues' hypothesis that there is a disproportionate impact of these cases and evictions. And I mean, it's really unfortunate that I wasn't able to look at a zip code wide level data, because I think the effects would be even more pronounced. But that's what it is, and I would like to thank you all for watching my presentation, and thank you to Dr. Wheeler, and stay safe, everyone.